Hi everyone, my name is Callie McNutt. I'm the Director of External Affairs at the Foreign Policy Initiative. I'm sorry Jamie Fly had to step out for a second, but he will be back to close us out for the afternoon. I'm very excited to introduce our final panel for the day. We are delighted to have Representative Adam Kinzinger, Congressman-elect Tom Cotton, and FPI board member Dan Senor. This panel is entitled Perspectives from Emerging National Security Leaders from the Front Lines of Capitol Hill. So I'm just going to give a quick intro to Dan Senor, and he will then introduce our other panelists. Dan, as I mentioned, is one of our co-founders of the Foreign Policy Initiative, so he's been with us since 2009 when we began. He also was a senior advisor to presidential nominee Mitt Romney and vice presidential nominee Paul Ryan. Additionally, he's the author of Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle. And without further ado, let's get started. So let's welcome our guest. Thank you.
Callie.
One more thing. Please don't forget to tweet. I think you already have heard, but we're hashtag FPI Forum. And additionally, we are having a film screening at the French Embassy tonight, The Oath of Tobruk. If anyone was here for Bernard-Henri Lévy's panel earlier, it's his film. This is the premiere. So I hope you can join us at the French Embassy at 7:30. Thank you all.
Thanks, Callie. You know, as you probably have heard throughout the day, and for those of you that are familiar with the Foreign Policy Initiative, one of the things we try to do is talk about the issues of foreign policy and America's role in the world and try to counter any sort of neo-isolationism that crops up in our politics, either on the left or the right. And this is a particularly challenging thing to do at a time when much of the public discourse is not really focused on foreign policy at all, which is why Tom and Adam are particularly two interesting people from our standpoint, because, as Callie said, not only are they emerging national security leaders, but one of the reasons they are is because these are both men who've been elected to Congress, who've had to wrestle with issues on the campaign trail, talking about issues like foreign policy, and have also served in our military. Congressman Kinzinger is in the U.S. Air Force, still in the Air Force Guard. He is a major. Congressman-elect Cotton is a captain, or was a captain in the U.S. Army. Both of these individuals joined after September 11th. They can speak to their own experiences, but September 11th, 2011 was an impetus, a spark, a major motivation for their decision to join the military. Tom was in Iraq in 2006 and 2008. Sorry, he was in Iraq in 2006 and Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009. Adam has served in a number of different units and various operations in the Air Force. So they have tremendous real-life experience in uniform, and they have tremendous experience in the war of ideas, and the war of ideas over issues related to national security. And so we're very lucky to have them here. And I just want to jump into a few questions for them, get a discussion going, and then open it up to all of you so they can hear what is on your mind. And I'll throw it to both of you. I'll start with you, Adam, first. This issue of how you talk about the issue of foreign policy and national security as a candidate for office at a time when the country is so focused on other issues. And you are also someone who's known for your work advancing fiscal conservatism. So how do you, when you're spending time in your district, when you're talking to various stakeholders around the country, how do you strike a balance between the case for fiscal responsibility and the case for dedicating the resources that we believe we need to dedicate to the nation's defense?
Well, first off, Dan, thanks, and thanks for having me. I was here last year with Senator Kirk, and we obviously, our prayers are with him, and I think you'll be seeing Senator Kirk come back very soon, by the way, which will be great for all of us. But, you know, that's an interesting thing. I'll tell you where I was really motivated was in, I think it was 2006. When Iraq was obviously looked like it was going haywire. Nobody believed we could win in Iraq. And Harry Reid stood up in front of the country and said the war is lost. And I remember how much anger inside I literally felt that one of the most powerful men in the country would stand in front of TV cameras and say that the war in Iraq is lost. And at that point, I actually began to get a little upset that I didn't see Republicans out saying the opposite, that this is a war that we can win. So that early on to me was something that very much motivated me to say, if I ever am in a position like that, not actually expecting to be anytime soon, but if I'm in a position like that, one of the things you have to do as a congressman is lead. America is desperate for leadership right now. And I think being able to talk about the fact that we have a fiscal crisis in this country, but also talking about the importance of a strong national defense, that is the #1 job of the federal government before anything else, is to ensure its people are safe and that you have a strong defense. I think being able to connect those two and saying, okay, you got to fund a federal government, very first priority is a good, strong military. To be able to connect those two to folks, those two issues to folks, is something that I find very important and that I think's been lacking, and something that I think, frankly, the Republicans and, frankly, fiscal hog Democrats, or I mean, national defense hog Democrats, have got to do a better job of standing up and making the case. And I would say the same thing for President Obama, by the way, making the case for American leadership and why it's important. And that's something that's been lacking, something we need to do a better job of.
So, Tom, you just came after a race. Just for those of you who don't, Tom represents a district in Arkansas. Adam represents a district in Illinois. Tom was just elected for the first time this past November. He'd been involved in politics, but this is his first time with his name on the ballot, and he won his primary, won his general election. So, you know, when I was traveling around over the last few months on the presidential campaign, with Vice Presidential nominee Ryan, then Vice Presidential nominee Ryan. You know, I was struck because he would talk about all these domestic and fiscal issues, and he'd get a positive reaction. And then when he would talk about the sequester and he'd talk about defense cuts, I was struck the degree to which it touched a nerve with people, the reaction that issue got. So they were able to, people were sort of instinctively able to strike this balance that you were speaking to. How did you deal with these issues? Did you find the same thing?
Well, thanks, Dan, for moderating this discussion. It's great to be here. I had the same experience on a slightly smaller scale than Paul Ryan would have in rural Arkansas.
Just a matter of time. Just a matter of time, Tom.
Until he gets back to the small experience in southeastern Wisconsin. Same experience when you talk about the sequester, the spending cuts the military has already faced, and the need to support our warfighters who are downrange now. Americans kind of intuitively understand, even if they don't know all the ins and outs of every foreign policy that we have with every country, the need for a strong national defense. That is the first and foremost responsibility of the federal government, even if it doesn't always get talked about first on the campaign trail. More broadly in my experience, this was my first campaign, as you alluded to. I've never run before. I've never really worked on a campaign before. Foreign policy and domestic policy, I found, were very different realms. Most people have pretty firm convictions and actually a lot of information about domestic policies. You know, they believe what they believe on something like, say, Second Amendment rights. They don't need, despite what the media and the political class in Washington might tell you, the monthly unemployment numbers to tell you what unemployment is. They know it. You know, I was in church this weekend, and our pastor, added to the normal list of prayers, the prayers for the people who are still unemployed going into the Christmas season. They experience those things firsthand. So oftentimes when they are asking a candidate a question, they want to see if the candidate agrees with them on views they have. But when they ask questions about foreign policy like Afghanistan or Egypt or Libya, they're asking questions about which they don't have firsthand knowledge. So there's much greater room, as Adam says, for leadership and for persuasion and actually trying to inform the voters to recognize that their instincts are right, that they think America should be strong and leading in the world, but because they don't experience it firsthand the way they do the economy, that we as political leaders actually have to go out and make the case for why we should continue to lead in the world.
I want to add to that, because Tom made a very good point. I do a series of town hall meetings. I love doing them. And I get inevitably the question of Afghanistan. And what do we do there? And I'll tell you, from a political perspective, if I was doing this because I wanted just great applause all the time, the easiest thing to say is to stand in front of a group of people and say, we have got to get out. It's time for our men to come home, men and women to come home. And you would probably get some applause. But people, what I noticed is, while they are in that town hall meeting and they initially are of the opinion, because they've heard no differently, that it's time to come home, when you stand up and you make the case for why victory is essential, and why not only is victory essential, but why being defeated is absolutely something we cannot accept as a nation, they're turned like that. And it's because they're desperate for somebody to tell them why. and it hasn't been done.
So I want to come back to Afghanistan in a minute. Let's take an issue that you both may be dealing with in a very real and concrete way in the months ahead, which is the issue of Iran, and how we deal with Iran if there isn't more progress made on isolating Iran and getting them to suspend their nuclear program, and whether it's the U.S. that has to take more concrete action or Israel takes more concrete action. So you're now in this Republican conference in the House, and the Republican conference is dealing with a range of issues, as we said, on the domestic and the fiscal side. Where are they on some of these issues? Are they, the idea of America or just having to confront very difficult issues, bad actors like the case of Iran, or having to stand by allies who are dealing with it? What is the attitude sort of make this go away? This is the last thing I want to be talking about right now for the very same reasons that you talked about in Afghanistan, or is there an openness to it?
Well, there's a lot of things we want to just make go away,
right.
So, i.e. the fiscal cliff discussions. Right. But no, the reality is I think within the Republican caucus, from what I've seen, it's very unified in saying that we can't allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. In fact, that we have to be much more intense on putting a real red line in the sand, because if you don't do that, they're going to continue to assume they can push that line, and they can, frankly, until we put the red line in and say, you can pursue nuclear weapons all you want, but you will understand that that will lead to the destruction of your nuclear weapons facilities, because we have the ability to do it, and we're going to do it, so now you have a choice to make. So people feel that way. The problem is when we get into the discussion about sequester and these significant cuts to the military that are coming, and the discussion of what to do about Iran, the two can't be mutually exclusive. If you have sequester come into play, you are absolutely limiting your options on what you can do in Iran, what you can do around the world, and you're putting yourself vulnerable. You're making yourself vulnerable. So I think the two can't be mutually exclusive discussions. They're the same. If we're going to significantly cut the military beyond what we already have, we have to accept the fact that we're limiting our options, whether it's in Iran or other parts of the world where we need American strength and leadership.
Tom?
Well, I'm in town for orientation, so I'm still trying to find the cafeterias.
And the last thing you want to do is start criticizing your colleagues.
I can't intuit what my future colleagues might think, but I can tell you what Republicans, out in Arkansas think, which is that Iran is an existential threat to Israel most immediately, but ultimately to the United States as well. We're the two leading countries in what used to be called the West, and Iran is one of the leading countries that's opposed to the West. In the end, Iran's regime, I think, is motivated by what tyrannies everywhere are motivated by, which is regime survival. And I think we have to turn up the pressure on them to a significant degree that they recognize that their survival is imperiled, whether that means because the cost of food or gas or other basic supplies is up so high due to sanctions that their people revolt against them, or if it means, a military strike by Israel, by the United States, maybe in conjunction with other allies as well. They have to recognize that that is what's on the table, and only then, could we hope that they will no longer be pursuing nuclear weapons capability.
On Afghanistan, there's talk right now, there are rumors about a possible significant drawdown being announced in the weeks ahead by the administration. What is you've been deeply involved with the issue of Afghanistan. What is your view on where things are heading with Afghanistan? So
the Taliban have a saying, it says, America has the watches, but we have the time.
Right.
So they understand that all they need to do is outlast the United States' will. Let me first off say this. To be defeated on the battlefield is one thing. We'll never be defeated on the battlefield. But it's one thing to be defeated. But to have our will defeated is something completely different. And that sends shockwaves, I think, to our allies through the rest of the world if America is defeated by its will. I'm very disappointed. Look, the reason we won significantly because of the surge in Iraq, in my opinion, is not necessarily the addition of 20,000 troops, but it was the message that we sent. At a time when everybody was saying, get out, President Bush said, not only am I not getting out, I'm sending 20,000 additional troops and we're going to win. And you saw on a dime the opposition say, you know what, we can't beat them on the battlefield. I'm going to put my gun down, I'm going to pick up a gun for the coalition forces and protect my neighborhood. The same problem we had in Afghanistan, the president did the right thing in surging there. He did the wrong thing in saying, but we're out by 2014. Because they've been fighting these wars for years. and they can say, well, okay, cool, we can outlast them till 2014. So where do I see the situation now without getting too into it? We're seeing the Afghans begin to take control of significant portions of Afghanistan. We're able, I think, in a position where we can begin to step down our role and allow them to step up. But let's not get in a hurry to do it before it's time. We're going to have to understand that beyond 2014, there will probably have to be some United States presence in a counter-terrorist role and maybe continuing to train in a calming presence. I think that's a mistake we made in Iraq. We pulled the troops out and there wasn't a calming presence there. So I'm not overly to the point of saying this war is over, but I sure hope the president makes the right decision and says we can win in Afghanistan still, and he needs to make that case to the American people.
So, Tom, do you have any hope that the president will do that?
I always have hope.
Hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, no, hope is not a strategy. I would urge him, to stick to the original timetable that, as Adam said, he erroneously set in 2009, which is to maintain the current level of fighting forces, about 70,000 troops, to the end of the 2014 fighting season. And then there can be, some discussion about what we transition to after that. The Kagans had a good article in the Washington Post yesterday about the need for about 35,000 troops on the ground to provide counterterrorism operations, but also to support those operations. More broadly, though, I think the president has erred repeatedly when he has conducted basically half measures. When the generals proposed a strategy that he accepted in 2009, recommended a force of 40,000 troops to surge in, and he proposed 32,000. Kind of an arbitrary 20% cut, I think, for political reasons, or imposing deadlines, as Adam said. When Adam was outraged that Harry Reid was saying the war and loss is 2006. I was out patrolling the streets of Baghdad. And I could tell you that they were very active in following the Western news. And they weren't supporting us because they knew that, we might be gone in 6 months or a year. And al-Qaeda and the former regime sympathizers would still be there. In Afghanistan in 2008, I was there for the presidential election. And a lot of Afghanistan still looks like it probably did when Alexander was there, except most people have cell phones. And they would come up to me the day after the election and said, what do you think about Barack Obama? And I was like, how do you know that? You're standing in a valley in Afghanistan. It's like, oh, I got a cell phone. I saw it on text message. So they follow the news very carefully coming from the West. And to send any signal that we might precipitously withdraw or that we're not going to be a steadfast ally after 2014 just accelerates a declining security situation in Afghanistan.
Can I add one quick thing to that? So it would be naive to say we're never going to be in a situation again where we need to go into a country and rebuild it or whatever. It'd be naive to just say that that's never going to happen again. So you look at Vietnam and the pullout of Vietnam and the people that died as a result of that frankly put their lot in with the United States. And then you look at Afghanistan. Theoretically, if we pull out of Afghanistan and you consider potential, I guess, a torrent of evil coming into Afghanistan as a result of that and people dying who stood up and said, I believe in the United States of America. How are we ever going to be able to enlist the support of the people of a country that we need again when 2 times when we've done it, we've pulled out precipitously and left people really defenseless? And that's scary to me.
And I mean, put yourself in al-Qaeda's position. If you... Lawrence Wright's History of al-Qaeda, The Looming Tower, talks about how they really got their start in the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. They believed, they propagated a mythology that they had defeated one of the great 2 Western apostate countries. Now that's false. They didn't. It was the Afghan people and with American assistance. But that's what they believed. If we were to precipitously withdraw from Afghanistan, leaving it in a state like it was when we found it in 2001, that would be a huge boost for them. It'd be a huge morale boost, a huge recruiting boost, a boost in their prestige around the world, America's enemies. We can't let them have that boost. We actually have to fight them and ensure that they don't have that kind of boost to that morale and recruiting and their effectiveness around the world.
So let's, do you feel in Iraq, both of you, do you feel in Iraq that we are watching now with the Maliki government the potential for real drift and potentially falling to under other spheres of influence in the region, for instance, like Iran? How serious of a risk is that? Is that something that we should be, what can we do about it at this point? I'll start with you.
Well, what can we do about it? I guess now it's diplomacy because we've withdrawn all our military. I mean, the reality is in Iraq, probably, I think I've heard estimates up to 1/3 of American casualties were a result of Iran. I mean, they were significantly involved in the future of Iraq, whether we wanted to admit it publicly or not. This was significant. In fact, our check on Iran was actually Iraq prior to the war. Now that we went in there, if you imagine, and again, that's why I say when we withdrew all the troops, we took away any influence, any calming influence. Sure, there's State Department personnel there still, but you withdrew that calming influence and basically gave Iraq the ability to say, let's do whatever we want. And as you're seeing now, there's discussions and coalition building with Iran, and an Iraq-Iran alliance I think would be devastating to the interests, not just of the United States, but to stable regimes in the area, to stable countries in the area that we count as allies, and specifically, most importantly, I think, to Israel.
Your question recalls to me the old joke about assessing the French Revolution, that it's too soon to tell. It's very too soon to tell in Iraq. If we had had the 2 or 3 brigade stay-behind force that the theater and combatant commanders wanted, it would have been a lot easier to influence their government. You know, that's not a big force either. You know,
many people in the administration want it.
Yeah, yeah, and you know that would have prevented even further Iranian intermeddling. It would have helped maintain the balance of power in the civilian government, continue to train the Iraqi security forces. So Adam's right. We don't have that, and it's not coming back. So the most pressure we have is diplomacy and working with our regional partners to ensure that Iraq stays where it was when we left, which is oriented towards the West and friendly and relatively stable, not oriented towards Iran.
If you look throughout the Middle East, and I'll get to Gaza, recent events in Gaza in a moment, but before that, the Arab Spring, or some say turned into an Islamist winter, it's complicated. It's going to continue to be increasingly complicated. One could argue we don't have tremendous leverage in the region with some of these governments, but one element of leverage we do have is foreign assistance we provide. In fact, if you look at Egypt, not just U.S. foreign assistance, you look at the assistance they receive from the IMF, from the European Union Development Bank, it's billions of dollars, plus the U.S. aid. What's the mood, I guess this is a question for you, Adam, in the Republican conference in the House, about how hands-on your colleagues want, you and your colleagues want our government to be in trying to shape events in a number of these newly reformed, if you will, speaking euphemistically about some of the governments, newly reformed post-Arab Spring governments. How much of a willingness is there to continue to dispense substantial aid? Or is, again, like your characterization of the fiscal cliff, make it go away?
I think there's, within the Republican caucus, I think there's pretty significant agreement that it's important to be involved at this point. Now, you're going to have some in my party that say, cut off all foreign aid, we're in debt, we can't use foreign aid. The reality is foreign aid, frankly, saves us money and saves us warfare, as far as I'm concerned. But I think what you're seeing in the party is a lot more of a belief that we have to actually use that foreign aid to actually get somewhere. So, for instance, with Egypt, when you see the president basically declare himself a dictator, now's the time to talk about what billions of dollars of aid to Egypt is for and what it does and what purpose it serves. Same thing with Pakistan. We've got to be willing to adjust that as necessary in order to achieve goals of stability and peace. It's not just a carte blanche, well, we've given you aid for 10 years, so here it goes. So I think that's very important, and I think that's where you're starting to see the discussion. I'll say, first off, I was one of only 6 Republicans that actually voted to support the president's intervention in Libya. I am a believer that the Arab Spring had the potential, and still potentially could have the potential, of being a real force for freedom. The problem is what you've seen is in that power vacuum that occurs inevitably when a dictator is thrown out, the groups that are most organized can come forward and create a government. And we've seen that happening in radicalism. But in Libya, for instance, you actually see a government that appears to be, though it's weak at this point because it's new, appears to be fairly moderate and fairly secular and want to do the right thing for the region.
So Libya, I just want to I applaud you for sticking your neck out on that issue. I know it wasn't easy, and it wasn't, you were in a lonely place at the time. Did you take any heat from conservatives? I did. But again, if I voted simply because, in a way that I don't want to take heat, the path of least resistance, I don't know why I'd be out here in this job, because ultimately then you're just collecting a paycheck. The purpose of being a congressman and being in politics, you have to reflect your district, but you have to lead. And you have to explain the reasoning for this. And look, I was proud to be one of the only 6 Republicans to vote that way, and I talked about it a lot because in my mind it was the right way to go. History will judge that, but it appears right now that it is. Any view, Tom, on this issue of foreign assistance, making the case for foreign assistance at a time, that's probably not politically popular.
It is. Speaking again more from my perspective and experience with the Republican electorate, actually in this case, Republican and general electorate, because I had a competitive race in both my primary and my general election, there is, I think, a misperception in some corners of America that foreign aid is 25 or 30% of the budget, when I think it's actually less than 1%. I remember last fall, Governor Perry in one of the debates proposed to just zero out all foreign aid and then make each country re-justified each year. And, that had some appeal. And I remember being asked about it at a Tea Party forum, about a week later. I said, well, I understand the intuitive appeal, but, think about a country like Israel, where we have a 10-year memorandum of understanding to grant them about $3 billion a year of aid that's critical to maintaining their qualitative military advantage in a region where they're vastly outnumbered. We want to have those kind of tools available so we can support our allies around the world, influence the behavior of some of our marginal or ambivalent allies, and punish and restrain our enemies. And that's, again, I think, an example of an opportunity where we as political leaders have a chance to inform and persuade on foreign policy to a greater extent than we sometimes do on domestic policy.
And the best, by the way, example for foreign aid now that we have right in front of us, Iron Dome. All you have to do is mention Iron Dome. We all saw on the news, I was in Israel a year ago, and they were talking about the Iron Dome, and I was amazed at this. I thought the phalanx on base defense gun was great, but when I see a missile go up and change course immediately and blow up next to a rocket, that's amazing. That's what foreign aid buys you. It saves people's lives.
Absolutely. So let's talk specifically about Gaza, since you raised Iron Dome. How do people, colleagues of yours in the Republican conference, think about it? Because, over the last decade, you've had, the Israeli intervention in Jenin in 2002. You had the Israeli war in Lebanon in about 2006. You had the Israeli war in Gaza, 2008, 2009. So it feels, I think, to many people, at least I speak to, that every few years there's sort of an Israeli skirmish on one of its borders. Give or take 10, 20, or 30 days, depending on the depth and the breadth of the operation. Is that how people are viewing this? As just another skirmish on Israel's border, and they just need to sort of bat Hamas down to buy some time? Or do they view what's going on in Gaza as part of a broader strategic context as it relates to Iran and the kind of things Iran is trying to do to establish hegemony in the region?
Well, I think we're starting to see, from my colleagues, I can tell you, I think they're seeing it as a broader issue, and it is. From the electorate, I don't know. Maybe it's just, a lot of the times you mention it, before I started paying really close attention, even so you take the late 90s, it just was another thing in Israel, right? Now you realize, though, everything that's happening in the region, whatever skirmish, whatever war, whatever rockets, whatever everything, it's really a proxy war right now against Iran. That's what's happening. I mean, the bad player in every one of these examples is Iran. They're supplying rockets. They're encouraging Hamas. That's the issue. So I think while we need to continue from an Israel perspective to bat down their enemies and ensure that their people are safe, very important, I think it's time to confront Iran and say, you know what, you either be a good actor in the region, you're not going to get nuclear weapons, or frankly, you have to face the consequences of it.
Tom?
The latest conflict in Gaza happened after the election, but something that was happening during the election was the civil war in Syria. And I can say, I certainly view that as just one more front in this broader offensive that Iran's waging throughout the Middle East, and that resonated with voters as well. They appreciate that Syria is one of Iran's most essential allies, and its proximity to Israel makes it very critical to Iran and its larger war against Israel. So I do think that most Americans, because most Americans do strongly support Israel, that's why the pro-Israel caucus in the House is so strong, and why the House is the strongest institution in the American government, more so than this or that president, certainly more so than the State Department, in defense of Israel, because it's the one most closely tied to the people. And they recognize kind of intuitively that Iran is waging this proxy war through Syria, through Hezbollah, through Hamas, and so forth. So it's not, so your experience with the electorate is not that voters just view this as another, it's a humanitarian catastrophe, but there are a lot of humanitarian catastrophes. They get there is an awareness about the strategic significance or the strategic uniqueness of Syria. Yes, and more generally too. I mean, if we as political leaders don't try to persuade and inform about something like Benghazi, I do sense that there's probably just a feeling among the American people is like, oh, it's complicated and messy, and we don't know who the actors are, and it's probably not the president's fault, and Mitt Romney probably wouldn't have done anything differently. But when it's Israel versus its enemies like Syria and Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, they understand very clearly where the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And like Prime Minister Netanyahu said, that there would be peace if the Palestinians would lay down their arms. If Israel laid down their arms, there would be no Israel. They get that.
I think it's important too. Something that I've been worried about, and I can't put a quantitative measure on it, but I feel like that unanimous support I'll call it unanimous support, theoretically, for Israel is kind of waning a little bit, because now you're hearing people talk about, well, the poor Palestinians, and you understand a lot of them are in bad position. But as much as understanding Palestine's right to exist, which I hear a lot about, the fact is they don't acknowledge Israel's right to exist. You still see people talk about the fact that the Jews never belonged. They never were in Israel in the first place. And it's amazing to hear that kind of talk and then to try to figure out how you can come to a solution when one group doesn't even feel that the Jewish people have a right to the land in the first place.
I'm going to open it up for questions. I have a hard time seeing, so here, I'll start with you over there. Just please say who you are and ask away. I would say fire away, but with these two guys here, I'm a little...
My name is Don Kirk. I've heard a lot about Iran today and all the sessions, but I haven't heard anything about North Korea and its supply of rockets and missiles and so forth to Iran. I wonder how that figures into the equation, and what you gentlemen, I would have liked to have asked some of the other people in the earlier panels, what you gentlemen would recommend doing about North Korea, considering its huge relationship with Iran in selling rocket missiles and nuclear technology. Thank you.
Well, I'd say the problem with North Korea is it's so isolated anyway. It's one of the most heavily sanctioned, well, it is the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. So, by the way, when we talk about sanctions, you look at that, and well, North Korea still has nuclear weapons and everything else. There's not a whole lot of leverage in North Korea. It's almost impossible to even put operatives, for instance, into North Korea. I think continuing to isolate them, continuing to have strong relationships with South Korea, and then to the extent that we can, building the strong relationship with China, who really does have the influence with North Korea. And somehow, and I can't give you all the ways that we can do that because I can't think of them right now, but influencing China to understand the danger Iran plays, the danger North Korea plays, to a stable world that I think China wants too, even though their vision of the world may be slightly different than ours.
Adam's right that the key to North Korea, South Korea, and China and our relationship there, and ensuring that that's one of the highest priorities in those two relationships. There's already a lot of sanctions against North Korea. It's a criminal syndicate regime. To continue to step up our non-proliferation activities, not just of weapons like rockets and missiles, but also their sources of revenue, drugs and American hard currency and so forth. But more generally, I think your point raises an important issue with Iran. Is North Korea and Pakistan show why Iran can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Because once a country goes nuclear, your options of dealing with it are much more limited.
And I see, look, North Korea, the regime's crazy, but they're not driven.
It's a technical term.
Yeah, they're technically crazy, but they're not driven by a zealot religious ideology, and Iran is. Iran makes comments about wiping Israel off the face of the earth. So when they have the technology to do it, what makes us think that they're going to actually, they weren't telling the truth, that that's not their intention. So while I consider North Korea a serious threat to peace and stability, I consider Iran even a more serious threat.
Yes.
John Kunstadter, Radzima Photo. I'd like to thank both of you gentlemen for your service.
Thank you.
Are you satisfied with the rules of engagement that we had in Iraq and that we have in Afghanistan? And if not, what can you do about it? Second question is, if the Chief of Staff of the United States Army can't bring himself to call what Hassan Nidal did by its real name, but called it workplace violence, do we have a problem with morale and the focus in our armed forces? And again, what would you propose to do about it as Congressman? Thank you.
I'll take the rules of engagement question. When I was in Iraq in 2006 and then Afghanistan in 2008, 2009, Our rules of engagement actually were not that constraining. The American military, along with the Israeli military, is an extremely humane, disciplined, moral fighting force. I think sometimes what happened is the way the rules were translated from black letter text to battlefield practices made them more constraining. I was actually in law school when the September 11th attacks happened, and I left my law practice to join the Army, and I've been clean for 8 years now. But I often got the lawyer-like jobs of doing things like giving rules of engagement classes, and one thing that I would always stress to soldiers is these are not as constraining as you think they are, or as that you've received from folk wisdom from the unit that came before us. So I think the rules were properly set, but the way they filter down, it's like, you know, if you've been in the Army and the commanding general wants to have a formation at 0600, you know that from every level, from the commanding general down to the private, each commander has 5 minutes prior, 5 minutes prior, 5 minutes prior. So you end up being on the parade field at 04:45 in the morning. I am comfortable with the rules as they were written when I was there. You know, I can't speak to what they are today because they do change, and that is classified information. On the second point, obviously, it was an act of terrorism, and I think our leaders, both military and civilian, should call it what it is.
Yeah, I'll speak on the rules of engagement. I'll say this broadly. If you know somebody intends to inflict harm on you or your men or women you're with, I think it's okay to take their life. Whether they've put their gun down and walked away or whether they're carrying a gun. If they intend to inflict harm on you, then they're a legitimate target. It is important to have rules of engagement, obviously, as we all know, because you don't want chaos, because that only creates more enemies than we fight. And I have to echo what Tom said. This administration's unwillingness to talk about terrorism, to call it, you know, theoretically evil acts, is bewildering to me. And I don't know what they seek to gain out of it. I mean, the reality is America is a nation at war. The president would even say that. We're a nation at war. We have to sell to the American people why their sons and daughters are going to war. But we're not doing that. We're just not doing that. We're not talking about terrorism. We're not talking about the need to win. We're not talking about what the mission is in Afghanistan, for instance. All we do is we'll do these military actions, and then we'll talk about something else and hope that we can just buy some time and get it done.
Question. Yes, right here.
Good afternoon, Michael Duga, Public Policy. Foremost, Dan, thank you for setting up the FPI and everything that you've done to party and for country.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you for your service, Cap, Major. Appreciate you both and what you do. Question for you today. A little bit off topic, but seemingly on topic. The Veterans Caucus within the Congress, as we all know, has been depleting at a rate that is just not acceptable in any way, shape, or form, regardless of party affiliation. What do both of you intend to do to bring some camaraderie on both sides of the aisle in the 113th Congress? Thank you for your time.
We just had, it's kind of fun, we actually recently had all the members who were veterans, those that showed up on time, by the way. You'd be amazed, even the veterans sometimes were late to this, but we all got a picture on the hills of those of us that still are in or have our uniforms, wear our uniforms. We got it on the front of the Capitol. It was a beautiful picture, and you see, you know, how great that is. My class, my freshman class from last term, I think of the 87 freshmen, something like 26, give or take 1 or 2, are veterans. It was the highest percent of veterans we've seen since, frankly, I think World War II. Seeing great guys like Tom come and join me on the Hill is outstanding. But look, I think it's important on both sides of the aisle to understand, to have that veterans perspective. Because let me tell you, as a military guy, I think I see things, and I'm not degrading anybody that's never served in the military, but I think I see things differently than they do in terms of tactically how to do things, understanding that in some areas we have to work as a team, because when everybody starts shooting at each other, you fail to accomplish even the most simple task versus working together as a team. And I think bringing that veteran perspective is an amazing, it's a great thing that we need. And so we need to continue as a party to outreach to those who have served to come in and continue their service now in the United States Congress.
And I think my freshman class has a dozen more veterans joining the Congress. And you know, I've gotten lots of emails over the last few weeks from friends of mine who are in the Army who are very excited that I won and said they might do something like that in the future. And I said, come on in, the water's fine. We do need more veterans in Congress. on both sides. And part of it is, what Adam says about, the actual experiences we have on the front lines, but also it's about the intangible skill sets and aptitudes that veterans have. And that's good not just for politics, for business as well. Dan's cataloged that in his book, Startup Nation, about the effect of the universal Israeli service in the Israeli economy. It's a great book. You can get it on Amazon in time for Christmas. It'll raise his ratings a little bit.
For every one of those, he gets a commission donation to his campaign. So it's.
But you see, I was in the infantry in the Army, and lots of soldiers would be finishing up their tour of service, and they say, well, what am I going to do in the civilian world? You can't knock down a bunker and take a trench line in the civilian world. And I would always try to encourage them to think about what they learned, especially the non-commissioned officers, those young leaders, more broadly, and kind of the intangible skills, teamwork, positive spirit, dealing with imperfect information, decision-making and ambiguity. Those are valuable in any setting, whether it's the United States Congress or a large company or a startup that you're running on your own. So I think we need to continue to encourage all Americans to recognize those intangible skill sets and aptitudes that veterans have.
And having veterans, by the way, also allows you to have a realistic discussion about the future of the military and what it looks like. Because a lot of times people who have never served in the military are always kind of yes to every general, yes to everything, because they don't want to be seen as anti-military. People like us can actually come in and say, really? I don't know if that's right.
I did on active duty a lot. I just didn't know.
Yes, right here, and then I'll move back. Go ahead.
Flavius Mihailles. A former U.S. ambassador has raised the possibility that the next genocide will likely be against the Alawites in Syria should the Assad regime fall. Is that something that you think those, at least in the Republican Party and among your fellow congressmen and women in the House, are taking into consideration? And if there is such a risk, what are the ways that should the U.S. End up giving more support to the opposition to ensure that they will follow and they will adhere to the humanitarian law and avoid the possible dramatic event?
Well, Syria is a very tough issue, as I'm sure you well know. The difficulty is, what does the opposition look like? I don't think, at least from the briefings I have, we have a solid grip on what the opposition is. It's basically a lot of people opposed to the regime and some nefarious actors that just want an opportunity to fill that power vacuum. I think the key is this, is when Assad, hopefully he does, falls, the United States needs to be willing to step in with aid, with assistance, with help in rebuilding a government based on democratic principles. I think that's going to be very important. As far as what we do now, I think providing aid to rebels to an extent is something we ought to continue to do and explore. I would love, theoretically, to be able to put up something like a no-fly zone. The problem is the reality behind doing that is very difficult. Syria has very good surface-to-air missile capabilities. It would be a significant involvement on our end. And ultimately, what does that do from the Russian perspective and everything else? Building alliances to the extent with the Russians and other players in the region to say, okay, look, there is a genocide, if you want to call it that, or a humanitarian crisis about to happen, and we need your help and involvement, would be a good way to go. Whether we can get there, I just don't know.
I do think Assad will fall. The real question is whether it's with more Western engagement and support or whether it's with less. And I think the more that we provide now, the more influence we'll have in what comes after. It is hard to imagine, I think, anything being much worse than what Syria has now, an oppressive, tyrannical regime that's closely aligned with Iran. So I would also, support, further engagement with the rebel forces, trying to, obviously identify the ones that are truly pro-Western or, support, constitutional government in a post-Assad Syria. And to the extent that a potential genocide could occur, that it could also be galvanizing, because it's one way I have found with, normal Americans who don't spend their days thinking about foreign policy like some of us do, is that it appeals, it appeals to their moral sense of rightness, that part of America's mission in the world is to stand up for religious liberty and the rights of women, and to stop genocide when and where we can.
I think we have time. How are we on time? Are we okay? One more question, I'm being told. One more question. So I'm just going to go right here, this gentleman. And I know Congressman Kinzinger you've got to get out shortly. Tom, so do you. Okay.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hi.
I'll try and keep the question as brief and precise as I can. We talked a lot about Iran's nuclear... Serge Thomas, by the way, is my name. We talked a lot about Iran's nuclear desires, but we seem to ignore an even bigger threat, which is Pakistan. Their internal instability, to me, is one of the biggest threats to any stability that Afghanistan could ever wish for. What should U.S. policy be with Pakistan in relations to maintaining stability in Afghanistan? And how can we basically break their internal logjam insofar as rogue elements of their military is concerned in supporting and fomenting terrorism, whether it is in the Kashmir or globally? Thank you very much.
And the question I'd pose back just theoretically here is, why are we frightened about instability in Pakistan? It's because they have nuclear weapons. It's because we could wake up tomorrow and find out there's been a coup d'etat by radical elements of Pakistan, and they now own an arsenal of nuclear weapons. At that point, what options do we have besides trying maybe militarily to secure these sites, which would be a almost end-of-the-world scenario as you think about it? I think that what you touched on, I think if we leave Afghanistan and leave that instability there and chaos, you will encourage, as Tom talked about, you will encourage Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in saying they just defeated the great Satan, or whatever they call us now, and they will triple the size of their membership overnight, because anybody that was bent towards jihadism or radicalism will now say that these are the groups we need to join because they just were effective. And you will put Pakistan in even a worse situation. So I think, again, engaging the Pakistanis to that level, obviously aid can be used as a weapon or an incentive. I think they're also engaging India and understanding that they play a strong role in regional stability. They are a natural alliance to the United States and a natural check on Pakistani instability and power.
Yeah, Adam's right. It's not the nature of the weapon, it's the nature of the regime. I'm not troubled that France or Great Britain have nuclear weapons. I'm not troubled by unconfirmed reports that Israel may or may not have nuclear weapons. I'm not troubled that Japan has nuclear weapons capability and could get nuclear weapons, in very short order, because those are all peaceful, Western-oriented regimes. It's the nature of the regime that could follow in Pakistan. So we have to use all the tools of national diplomacy. We have to use foreign aid. We have to use our military presence in Afghanistan that Pakistan has always viewed as necessary for providing strategic depth against India. We have to use our emerging alliance with India to help diffuse that tension between India and Pakistan, to prop up the pro-Western, pro-American sources or sources of support within the government, because there are a lot of those as well. I understand that the American people are war-weary in Afghanistan, in part because their commander-in-chief seems war-weary, but some Americans may be tired of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Afghanistan and Pakistan are not tired of America yet.
Good point, Tom. By the way, when's the last time you've heard the president use the word victory when he discusses Afghanistan? I'll just challenge you that. If you can find it, please send it to my office, because I'm interested.
But only do that once you do Tom's recommendation about ordering a copy of Startup Nation. I want to thank Congressman Kinzinger and Congressman-elect Cotton for an illuminating discussion. And I think it's a reminder, today's discussion is a reminder of how lucky we are to have people like them who both are willing to make the sacrifices that they each have made to serve in uniform, and also the sacrifices they've made to serve in Congress, and why it's so important for the foreign policy community, people in this room, to spend time building relationships, getting to know and work with people like Tom and Adam, because they really are, we believe, model future leaders on national security issues. So thank you both for being here, and thank you all for being here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to Dan and Congressman Kinzinger, Congressman-elect Cotton. That concludes our program here at the Newseum. I just flagged for all of you here in D.C. that you're welcome to join us at a film screening tonight, The Oath of Tobruk, Bernard-Henri Lévy's film, which will be at the French Embassy. And I'll also just end by saying to all of you watching on C-SPAN and in the room, please check out our website, foreignpolicy.org. Sign up for our daily foreign policy news email we call the Overnight Brief, and I look forward to seeing you at a future FPI event. Thanks for coming.